Thanks for watching live or listening back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hello and welcome to another Sunday Late Show on Teachers Talk Radio with me, Christopher Vowles, your host for this evening. Tonight is going to be a slightly different show because it's going to be a solo effort from me tonight, and I'd like to explore a topic that will be occupying the minds, I hope, of quite a lot of my Year 13 students over this summer break, which is NEA English Literature A-level coursework and different approaches as to how it might be done. And I'm going to hopefully offer you some ideas that might guide your development of NEA coursework planning based on some of the skills and some of the techniques my department employ in my current school. So that's what we're going to be looking at this evening. I'd be delighted if any of you would like to join in with your comments on the show, particularly if you've got any questions or queries about how we think of A-level English Literature NEA in our schools, how we plan for it, how we make sure the students are delivering things that are appropriate for the syllabus and are likely to inspire them to go on and produce some good pieces of work. So that's going to be the main focus of the show tonight. And obviously, I'm conscious it's been a while since we last spoke. I think my last show was back in, was it April, on aspects of AI use in the classroom. And there may well be some connections between the way we think about AI in our classrooms and in our students' independent work and some of the issues we're going to cover this evening. But I suppose I should start in my usual way, of course, and give you a sense of what I've been up to in the last month and a bit since we last spoke. Well, fortunately, my school term came to an end in June. About 3.5 weeks into June, we finally closed the doors and headed off for the summer holidays. In my case, it was quite a significant ending of the school year because I waved goodbye to one of my ECT and formerly PGCE mentor teachers, mentee teachers who was in my department, a student who I'd been looking after for a year and a bit since she joined us, but a student whom I'd taught for 2 years at A-level prior to her going off to do English literature at university and then come back to our school to train as a teacher. So that was quite an effective way of drawing me into thinking about how we do NEA, given that the student I was working with, the student teacher who I was working with, had sat her English Literature NEA work in our department and had then gone on to take the first steps in leading our students through it. So that happened at the end of the year. And then once everyone had gone home, I disappeared for a week to Cologne in Germany, where I caught up with some old university friends that I hadn't seen for a while. Upon my return, I've spent some time enjoying the sunny weather in North Yorkshire, while also catching up on some of the reading that I'm doing, both for the courses I'm teaching in a couple of years' time and for my own personal enjoyment. So the book I've been reading to teach for IGCSE in Year 11 is called Brooklyn by Colm Tóibín, described by The Guardian as the best book of the 21st century. In fact, a beautifully crafted work that transforms ordinary lives into something more extraordinary. It's all about the Irish American immigrant experience as the female protagonist in the 1950s leaves her Irish town and starts a new life in America, and then subsequently finds herself trapped between the two cultures. I can heartily recommend it. In addition to sitting down and reading it, I was also compiling a set of teaching notes for my department, so that when we move to this new text in 2 years' time, everybody should have some good questions to ask of the students and the starting point for some good text analysis work. Other than that, I've been reading lots of books about ships recently, and I'm currently in the middle of reading a book called Down to the Sea in Ships, which details the experiences of a journalist as he tours the world on a cargo ship passing through some of the most dangerous seas on the planet. Of course, if we look out into the world at the moment, some of the issues are going on in the Gulf, and some of the issues that are going on in the Red Sea and the South China Sea are anticipated by this book. And it was quite striking as I was watching some of the clips that we've been seeing in relation to the Straits of Hormuz, that I was going back to this book and seeing echoes of those moments there. So a bit of reading, bit of resting, and a bit of catching up with friends and family. It's amazing how rarely you get to see friends and family when you're working 6 days a week in a teaching job like mine. So I always look forward to the summer, and I'm always pleased when it finally comes along with its various opportunities. But anyway, on to the focus of tonight's show then. And that focus is A-level English Literature NEA coursework, and I'm going to share with you some of my insights that I've gained as a consequence of teaching this syllabus for nearly 20 years now, and for about 10 years in its new incarnation. I'm going to offer you a walkthrough of our process and a text. I'm going to talk to you about the approaches I use when I'm analysing the text that I've picked in the classroom. And then we might think about some things to consider when designing, monitoring, and authenticating assessment tasks for this unit. So I suppose the first thing to say is then that the particular syllabus that we teach in my school is a very, very powerful one in my view. It's called A-level English Literature B, and it's the AQA syllabus. And the thing I particularly like about this syllabus is it introduces students in a relatively accessible shorthand way to aspects of critical theory, which, as a former university English teacher myself, I think it's useful for students to have some experience of before they head off to the university seminar room. So that's the particular syllabus I'm going to be talking about today. It's a very popular syllabus with the schools that deliver it, and it's one of the 2 syllabuses that AQA offer at A-level in English literature. The other one, AQAA, is also an interesting syllabus. It's more focused, in my view, around themes in literature, whereas this one is more about theories and genre. So that's why we choose our particular syllabus. To give you some sense of context too, as we now operate in a world where students pick 3 A-levels and more or less stick with those all the way through their 2 years, rather than picking 4 subjects and then dropping one as they move from AS to A-level. I generally have class sizes of about 6 to 10 in most years, and that's somewhat different from the class sizes of 15 to 20 that we used to have prior to the switch to 3 A-levels as being the main route through the sixth form for most of the students I teach. So I'm teaching largely students who've come into the course for A-level literature with B grades or grade 6 or better at GCSE in English language and English literature. It's not always the case. I'm teaching a mixture of students that come from my own school, Year 11 group, and students who've joined us from other schools in England and other schools actually abroad, because we do have a number of students that choose A-level literature who are second language speakers, but pick it because they're interested in the comparative literature element with their own mother tongue. So that gives you some sense of the context in which we teach. The course itself is nicely divided between a full single year's worth of teaching for an exam topic, a full single year's teaching in the second year for an exam topic, and then this coursework NEA unit that bridges the 2 years, or it does in my school at least. So our students study a unit called Aspects of Tragedy for most of Year 12, in which they're studying some interesting tragic texts, Othello, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, A Streetcar Named Desire, and the poetry of Keats that they're examined on at the end of Year 13. And then in Year 13, they move on to study elements of crime writing, which involves them studying The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Shakespeare's Hamlet, and 2 other texts. So we deal with some interesting texts. The NEA unit, however, gives them the opportunity to explore critical theories for probably the first time in any significant depth. And the theories that are offered on the course are narrative theory, which is broadly speaking theories of the way stories are structured and told, eco-critical theory, which is broadly a theory about critics asking who speaks for nature, feminist theory, which is all about really who speaks for women, post-colonial theory, which is essentially in short form who speaks for the colonized, literary value, which is my own particular favorite area because it encompasses almost anything that could be somehow linked to the concept of literature, and then Marxist critical theory, which is who speaks for the working class or the economically marginalized would be a way of thinking about it. So those are the 6 theories that we introduce students to in bite-sized chunks. And the idea behind the whole NEA unit is the students will pick 2 theories from that list of 6. They will then write 1 essay on a novel of their choice or a short story collection by a single author, and then 1 essay on a poet of their choice. And the whole idea is that the essays that the students write have to be approached through the lens of one of those critical theories for each text. So the most important thing I think that all colleagues need to make sure they do really early on is that they need to know the syllabus rules and the limitations that apply to their particular syllabus. So in our case, students aren't allowed to study texts that aren't A-level standard texts. So there's that to consider. They need to be clear about the word length of their essays that they're working to. They need to know that referencing is going to be required before they submit those essays, and there are formal referencing conventions that have been pushed to the exam board by JCQ in their recent update on the way NEA is to be conducted. Clearly, there's a mark scheme. The joy of this particular approach to NEA is that the mark scheme is quite broad and quite open. So there are 5 assessment objectives, and students must cover all 5 in every essay they write for our particular syllabus. And each essay they write is always worth 25 marks, which is good. You'll need to be clear about the limitations on feedback, if there are any. There usually are. In our case, we're not allowed to give written feedback to our students on any of their NEA work. All of that must be done orally, and NEA are quite strict. AQA are quite strict about how that is to be delivered. And then you come to the text selection itself. You have to make sure that you're choosing texts that are suitable for the students to approach and that also don't appear anywhere else on the syllabus, which should seem or should initially sound quite simple, but the reality is that the course we teach actually contains 2 other examined option routes that we don't study. So we have to be quite careful in making sure that the students aren't picking a text that's on an exam that they don't sit, because if they did, then that wouldn't be admissible for coursework submission. So the really important thing then is knowing the syllabus rules and the limitations within which you're working. Then you turn to the examiner's report, and the examiner's report will give you some kind of steer in terms of how your course might be constructed. Because of the small number of students that I teach in my department, we give students the maximum freedom we possibly can over choosing their texts. So we compile a reading list for students suggesting texts that might work well on particular topics, and we show them past questions as models around which they can develop their own. But ultimately, we leave the decision of the text down to them. So provided the student can explain to me why they think their text is worthy of study, I'm usually quite happy to think up a question with them that will enable them to follow their own interest and their love of a particular text that they've chosen. So one way into doing that is making sure your students have a good sense of what texts they like, what texts they're interested in. And when it comes to the poetry essay in particular, although I'm not going to say much about the poetry essay tonight, this seems to be one where the students typically require the biggest steer. Many of them will come to your course, as they do to my course, having mainly read the 15 poems that they might have been asked to study at GCSE, and sometimes not having gone much further beyond those, certainly in years 10 and 11. We do have students who are voracious readers of poetry from time to time, but these are the exception, I would suggest, rather than the rule. One of the downsides of English literature at GCSE is that because there's so much to squeeze in, it seems to me that most of the mainstream schools in the country have generally tended to try and get through the poetry collection as quickly as they possibly can, so they can save time elsewhere to catch up with the rest of the work that needs to be got through before exam season begins. So you should perhaps expect some students to be less sure about poets that they're interested in than novelists or short story writers they're interested in. But once you've found something that piques their attention through reading some samples in class, some different mixtures of poets that they might know, but poems that they don't know by that known poet, or picking something completely new or strange or unusual. So we generally tend to take our students into it that way. So that's how we approach the theory of the syllabus that we teach, and I suppose partly why we teach it. I think it would be useful then if I offered you perhaps a sense of what it means to go into the process of planning the actual delivery of those lessons. So our coursework NEA starts in class in the Easter term of Year 12, generally after we've got through all of the Year 12 set texts for exams and after we've done our first set of mock exams. So it provides us with a nice window of about 4 weeks to 6 weeks to get started on that critical theory thinking. And the way that works on the side which I typically deliver, which is the prose side, is I will find a number of texts, extracts to read with them, and try and invite them to focus on a particular theory as we go through each text. So that's one particularly effective way into the text. So we will sit and read maybe 4 or 5 pages from a particular text, and we'll ask ourselves questions about how narrative theorists work, how eco-critical theorists work, how feminists, post-colonialists, literary value critics, and Marxist critics work, and start to build up the sense of their critical antennae, I suppose. Another way of thinking about it might be to invite them to put on a different pair of glasses each time they read the text. I'm going to share with you in a moment one particularly effective way, I think, of doing that in a relatively short space of time. One thing to say, of course, too, is AQA will issue you with something called the Critical Anthology, which is in itself an extract collection of different bits of theoretical writing that relate to each of the 6 critical theories. So one really effective way of starting to develop students' understanding of the critical theories is to use the introductory pages in the AQA anthology, explaining what eco-critics typically do, what narrative theorists typically do, what feminist literary critics typically do, and then try and look back at some of the texts they've already studied in Year 12 and ask them whether the theories apply in any particular way to those texts. So, for example, even though our students studied Tess and the D'Urbervilles as a tragic novel for an examination called Aspects of Tragedy, when you look back at it, there are some very strong elements of the text that stand out to you when you put on the Marxist glasses of a Marxist critic, or you put on the feminist glasses of a feminist critic, or my own particular favourite view, when you put on the eco-critical glasses of the eco-critic who looks back at the whole of the Tess of the D'Urbervilles novel and says, well, actually, Tess is a personification of the rural England that's being threatened by the Industrial Revolution. How else would Hardy make the point that Tess and the countryside seem to suffer together? But I'll leave that one to one side for the moment. So in the next part of the show, then, I will give you a walkthrough of how we teach a particular text and some of the ways in which we approach critical theory questions in response to that text. And we'll be right back after this.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week reports that a former Department for Education advisor and an Academy Trust founder have been given peerages in the House of Lords. Tim Lunig, Director of Economics at Public First and former government advisor, and David Ross, founder of the David Ross Education Trust, were nominated respectively by Lib Dem leader Ed Davey and Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch. Ross founded the trust, DRET, in 2007, and it has 36 primary schools and secondary schools across Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, Northamptonshire and London. He also chairs the New Schools Network. Lunig served as a chief analyst and policy advisor to the Department for Education between 2012 and 2018, and briefly served as senior policy advisor to the Conservative Education Secretary Gillian Keegan. More details can be found online. The TES magazine reports that Dame Christine Gilbert will lead a review into failings with Key Stage 2 SATs. Results for this year's exams for Key Stage 2 pupils were delayed by more than a week due to technical issues. The review will examine the precise nature of the issues and their origin. It will conclude this autumn. The review will also look at the role that Exam Board Pearson, contracted to run the SATs, had in the process, as well as that of the Standards and Testing Agency, the Department for Education and Ofqual. It will evaluate what changes can be made to improve and avoid further disruption going forward. 2026 is the first year that Pearson has run the Key Stage 2 SATs after winning the bid for the 4-year contract. Dame Christine is an experienced figure in education, is the current chair of Ofsted and is a former Chief Inspector of Schools. More details on TES magazine. Schools Week covers proposals from the Department for Education around the education of pupils who attend provision known as EOTAS, educated other than at school. The article says schools could be ordered to oversee arrangements for EOTAS pupils, and councils could have to provide approved lists of EOTAS providers and make them sign up to national standards. Families have told the DFE in its SEND reform consultation that education other than at school needs specific attention. The article covers 7 key points around possible changes, including considering safeguarding arrangements for online provision, the use of alternative provision for children with health issues, the monitoring of how long pupils access EOTAS provision, and the focus on approved lists for AP. More can be found on Schools Week. Finally, the BBC Health News site reports that children under 16 in England will be banned from buying high caffeine energy drinks from April 2027. Drinks containing more than 150 milligrams of caffeine per litre will be illegal to sell to children in shops, restaurants, cafes, vending machines and online. Lower caffeine soft drinks such as Diet Coke, alongside tea and coffee, are not affected. Drinks including Red Bull, Monster, Relentless and Prime would all breach the limit. The new rules are aimed at reducing obesity and preventing issues such as disrupted sleep, anxiety and lack of concentration, as well as tackling poor school results. The ban is subject to parliamentary approval and will be enforced by local authorities, with businesses who break the law facing fines of up to £2,500. More details can be found on the BBC. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Welcome back, everyone. So I'm talking about English Literature A-Level NEA coursework tasks this evening. And in the first part of the show, I just sketched out the context in which I'm currently working and delivering the AQA English Literature B specification for my department and my students, and talking a little bit about some of the theories and the ways that those might be set up as you approach this, what can be daunting task for some students, because as we move more and more towards 100% exam assessment at GCSE in English Literature and in English Language, this concept of coursework is in some respects quite an abstract one from students that have gone all the way through the UK state school system. And things like drafting are skills that they're perhaps only really still familiar with in subjects like design and technology. So it's really quite important that you give students a sense of what English coursework essay drafting works, or how it works and what it feels like while they're in the process of preparing to start that work. So one thing we do quite early on is a dummy run, if you like, of what a coursework essay feels like to write, by asking students to write on a text that won't be examined for the NEA because it's one that we already teach. So ask them to apply a critical theory to usually a poem they've already studied, so that it's giving them those skills that they need to develop to take on into the real thing. So once we've done that, we start looking at particular texts and some of the ways in which applying lenses to a particular text can generate some interesting observations that may then go into shaping and forming their own essay question. And we do tend to give our students individual essay questions, and they all tend to pick their own individual texts, which is, if you can possibly manage it, a good way of ensuring that no student is at risk of falling foul of any plagiarism regulations. So that's one approach. If it's possible in your department to operate, it's well worth doing. All of our students, once they return from the summer holiday, when they start writing their first draft, are also assigned an individual teacher who they work with quite closely, so that it's clear that the student and the teacher have a good understanding of the text and the ways in which that text might be written about in coursework. But here's one story that I like to explore. It's one of my favourite groups of lessons that I teach every year in year 12. And it's essentially an approach to teaching theory that comes out of the idea that fairy tales tend to contain in miniature almost all of the elements of plot you could wish to find in any longer texts. So if it's okay with you, and if you're all sitting comfortably, I'm actually going to read you a story. And this is The Four Skillful Brothers, written by the Brothers Grimm. The Brothers Grimm themselves, of course, quite skillful in producing countless fairy tales to engage readers from all ages, from those not yet quite literate, listening to their parents read to them, to those who look back at them with the wizened grey beards of experience and say, that's what it was all about. So this story is called The Four Skillful Brothers. And the thing I like about this text is, A, it's very short. So when you've got 50-minute lessons like we have, to try and get at students' sense of a critical theory tied to textual specific elements, it's really quite an effective way in our experience of doing it. So here we go, The Four Skillful Brothers by the Brothers Grimm. There was once a poor man who had 4 sons, and when they were grown up, he said to them, "My dear children, you must now go out into the world, for I have nothing to give you, so set out and go to some distance and learn a trade and see how you can make your way." So the 4 brothers took their sticks, bade their father farewell, and went through the town gate together. When they had travelled about for some time, they came to a crossway which branched off in 4 different directions. Then said the eldest, "Here we must separate, but on this day in 4 years from now we will meet each other again at this spot, and in the meantime we will seek our fortunes." Then each of them went his way, and the eldest met a man who asked him where he was going and what he was intending to do. "I want to learn a trade," he replied. Then the other said to him, "Come with me and be a thief." "No," he answered, "that is no longer regarded as a reputable trade, and the end of it is that one has to dance upon the gallows." "Oh," said the old man, "you need not be afraid of the gallows. I will only teach you to get such things as no other man could ever lay hold of, and no one will ever detect you." So he allowed himself to be talked into it, and while with the man became an accomplished thief, and so dexterous that nothing was safe from him if he once desired to have it. The second brother met a man who put the same question to him, what he wanted to learn in the world. "I don't know yet," he replied. "Then come with me and be an astronomer. There is nothing better than that, for nothing is hid from you." He liked the idea and became such a skillful astronomer that when he had learnt everything and was about to travel onwards, his master gave him a telescope and said to him, "With that canst thou see whatsoever takes place either on earth or in heaven, and nothing can remain concealed from thee." A huntsman took the third brother into training and gave him such excellent instruction in everything which related to huntsmanship that he became an experienced hunter. When he went away, his master gave him a gun and said, "It will never fail you. Whatsoever you aim at, you are certain to hit." The youngest brother also met a man who spoke to him and inquired what his intentions were. "Would you not like to be a tailor?" said he. "Not that I know of," said the youth. "Sitting doubled up from morning till night, driving the needle and the goose backwards and forwards, is not to my taste." "Oh, but you are speaking in ignorance," answered the man. "With me, you would learn a very different kind of tailoring, which is respectable and proper, and for the most part, very honourable." So he let himself be persuaded, and went with the man and learnt his art from the very beginning. When they parted, the man gave the youth a needle and said, "With this you can sew together whatever is given you, whether it is as soft as an egg or as hard as steel, and it will all become one piece of stuff, so that no seam will be visible." When the appointed 4 years were over, the 4 brothers arrived at the same time at the crossroads, embraced and kissed each other, and returned home to their father. "So now," said he, quite delighted, "the wind has blown you back again to me." They told him of all that had happened to them, and that each had learnt his own trade. Now, they were sitting just in front of the house under a large tree, and the father said, "I will put you all to the test and see what you can do." Then he looked up and said to his second son, "Between 2 branches up at the top of this tree there is a chaffinch's nest. Tell me how many eggs there are in it." The astronomer took his glass, looked up, and said, "There are 5. Then the father said to the eldest, "Fetch the eggs down without disturbing the bird which is sitting hatching them." The skillful thief climbed up and took the 5 eggs from beneath the bird, which never observed what he was doing, and remained quietly sitting where she was, and brought them down to his father. The father took them and put one of them on each corner of the table, and the 5th in the middle, and said to the huntsman, "With one shot thou shalt shoot me the 5 eggs in 2 through the middle." The huntsman aimed and shot the eggs, all 5 as the father had desired, and that at one shot. He certainly must have had some of the powder for shooting round corners. "Now it's your turn," said the father to the 4th son. "You shall sew the eggs together again, and the young birds that are inside them as well, and you must do it so that they are not hurt by the shot." The tailor brought his needle and sewed them as his father wished. When he had done this, the thief had to climb up the tree again and carry them to the nest and put them back again under the bird without her being aware of it. The bird sat her full time, and after a few days the young ones crept out, and they had a red line round their necks where they had been sewn together by the tailor. "Well," said the old man to his sons, "I begin to think you are worth more than green clover. You have used your time well and learnt something good. I can't say which of you deserves the most praise. That will be proved if you have but an early opportunity of using your talents." Not long after this, there was a great uproar in the country, for the king's daughter was carried off by a dragon. The king was full of trouble about it, both by day and night, and caused it to be proclaimed that whosoever brought her back should have her to be his wife. The 4 brothers said to each other, "This would be a fine opportunity for us to show what we can do," and resolved to go forth together and liberate the king's daughter. "I will soon know where she is," said the astronomer, and looked through his telescope and said, "I see her already. She is far away from here on a rock in the sea, and the dragon is beside her watching her." Then he went to the king and asked for a ship for himself and his brothers, and sailed with them over the sea until they came to the rock. There the king's daughter was sitting, and the dragon was lying asleep on her lap. The huntsman said, "I dare not fire. I should kill the beautiful maiden at the same time." "Then I will try my art," said the thief, and he crept thither and stole her away from under the dragon, so quiet and dexterously that the monster never remarked it, but went on snoring. Full of joy, they hurried off with her on board ship and steered out into the open sea. But the dragon, who when he awoke had found no princess there, followed them and came snorting angrily through the air. Just as he was circling above the ship and about to descend on it, the huntsman shouldered his gun and shot him through the heart. The monster fell down dead, but was so large and powerful that his fall shattered the whole ship. Fortunately, however, they laid hold of a couple of planks and swam about the wide sea. Then again they were in great peril, but the tailor, who was not idle, took his wondrous needle and with a few stitches sewed the planks together, and they seated themselves upon them and collected together all the fragments of the vessel. Then he sewed these so skillfully together that in a very short time the ship was once more seaworthy, and they could go home again in safety. When the king once more saw his daughter, there were great rejoicings. He said to the 4 brothers, "One of you shall have her to wife, but which of you it is to be, you must settle among yourselves." Then a warm contest arose among them, for each of them preferred his own claim. The astronomer said, "If I had not seen the princess, all your arts would have been useless, so she is mine." The thief said, "What would have been the use of your seeing if I had not got her away from the dragon? So she is mine." The huntsman said, "You and the princess and all of you would have been torn to pieces by the dragon if my ball had not hit him. So she is mine." The tailor said, "And if by my art I had not sewn the ship together again, you would all of you have been miserably drowned. So she is mine." Then the king uttered this saying, "Each of you has an equal right, and as all of you cannot have the maiden, none of you shall have her, but I will give to each of you as a reward half a kingdom." The brothers were pleased with this decision and said, "It is better thus than that we should be at variance with each other." Then each of them received half a kingdom, and they lived with their father in the greatest happiness as long as it pleased God. The end. So the Brothers Grimm there offering us a dramatic tale of brotherly competition, kingly dispensation, paternal pride, certainly paternal challenge from the father at the beginning of the story. Again, the presence of a dragon as a foe, a dragon as a threat to a human community and society. So some of these will, of course, be well recognized as tropes by many of your students in your class. I don't think there's a single student who could have watched Shrek, for instance, without experiencing some of the tropes that appear in that particular Brothers Grimm story. And the Brothers Grimm stories are very, very good ways of getting students interested in critical argument and debate, getting them to identify stereotypical tropes that we would expect to see in particular kinds of texts that critics might pick up on, and for doing it quite economically. Most of the tales are little more than 4 or 5 pages long when they're photocopied, and they're all, of course, out of copyright, which is a good thing too, if you're looking to encourage students to engage with texts that they haven't necessarily bought themselves. So lots of good reasons to do Grimm, particularly good reasons to do this story, because the way I tend to teach it is we spend a lesson reading the story and thinking about how it works as a narrative, which is that first theory on the list of 6. And we spend a lot of time looking at how the position of the narrator determines quite a lot of how we experience the events in the story. And we do a lot of work on how the text might be different if the text were told from the perspective of any one of those characters. So I suppose one question you might ask is, how would the story be different if it were told from the perspective of, say, the princess, or even the dragon, or possibly even the father at the start of the story? And once you've read the story through once, it doesn't take more than about 10 minutes, you can get the essential elements of the plot into the students' heads quite quickly. And of all the theories in the collection that AQA set, I'd suggest that narrative is possibly the hardest to teach if you're looking at an extract from a long novel, unless you're looking at something very experimentally weird, like an extract from, say, a Samuel Beckett novel, where the same character repeats more or less the same words in slightly different sequences 100 times across 6 pages. Or if you're looking at something like very specific use of internal monologue or free indirect discourse or stream of consciousness by somebody like Virginia Woolf. Or if you're looking at something that deliberately decides not to follow any conventions of storytelling at all in the way that we might understand them. So it's a really useful way of getting students thinking about the way texts are constructed. Events follow in sequence through a plot on the fundamental principles of narratology, this idea that random or seemingly random events can be tied together to form a coherent narrative, even if those events are out of linear sequence. And it gives students the chance to get to know the characters. So a lesson spent just looking at the way the text is told and who is telling that text is a good approach to take to teaching this kind of story. After that, you can have quite a lot of fun with the text itself, because you have the opportunity, I would suggest, of reading the same text wearing a different set of lenses each time. So what might an eco-critical theorist say about this text? Well, they might be interested in the way in which nature seems to exist in this text as primarily something to be destroyed or something to be feared. So one might wonder whether the dragon stands in for any other kind of natural catastrophe. Is the dragon actually a form of winged weather event? Is the dragon in fact a flood? Is the dragon in fact an earthquake? Is the dragon in fact some kind of non-fatal illness? So you have that sense of the way in which you might approach questions about eco-critical readings of the text. The one that gets students most animated, it seems to me, is the approach that a feminist critic might take. So if you ask your students, once they're familiar with some of the techniques that feminist critics use, the question, what questions would a feminist critic ask of this text? Then you get some really quite interesting questions indeed. So one way of doing that is to just get students to mind map some of the questions that they think a feminist critic might read in groups, and then get the students to pose those questions to other groups. I quite like doing this by circulating each group's mind map around the groups and getting the students to write their answers to the questions of the other groups on the sheet in front of them. So typical questions you might get might include things like, did the princess actually consent to go away with the dragon? Was she looking for an escape from her father's kingdom? Questions like, why does the princess never get to speak in the text that I've just read to you? Or even questions like, what happened to the princess's mother? Or what happened to the mother of the 4 skillful brothers? Because she is also a notable absent presence in this particular story. And I'm sure you'll all be familiar with this concept of absent presences in texts. We see them all the time in fairy tales, and here is no exception. So getting students to think about the way in which a feminist critic may ask questions of the text is a really nice way of getting students thinking about how to interrogate a text. and then discussing the answers that come out of that. Often some of the most interesting aspects of the lesson are how the students respond to each other's questions. Of course, the story also lends itself well to questions about Marxist critical theory. So one might ask the question as to how the upbringing of the sons in their father's house, a father who clearly needs to send his sons out to work as quickly as possible because he can't afford to support them in adulthood, how the upbringing of the sons differs from the upbringing of the princess. So again, yes, there's a gendered element there, but actually you can focus quite precisely on the significance of the market in the case of both of these texts. So I suppose one way of thinking about it is that the princess belongs to a kind of political economic market in which her marriage, one suspects, is being used to cement future alliances, whereas the sons of the man at the start of the story are having to go out and ply a trade in the marketplace. They are having to acquire some kind of skill, knowledge, or expertise for them to carry their value. Their value isn't passed down to them, notably, by their father, unlike the value of the princess in the text. So questions that a Marxist critic might ask of this text also open up some interesting discussions. Of the other theories on the list, post-colonial is the one that possibly doesn't work quite so well, unless one perhaps wonders why the king is so willing to give up half of his kingdom to each of the particular successful brothers. So, or in fact, it's not, isn't it? It's half of 4 kingdoms to each, half of 2 kingdoms to each of the 4 brothers, sorry. So one might ask the question as to why the power of the king is being divided in the way that it is, or the power relationships between the central kingdom and the monarchy and the peripheral aspects of the kingdom or the wider empire, because one assumes the king isn't giving up the kingdom in which his palace is sited. So there's that angle, although that's a bit of a stretch. And then the final one, of course, literary value, is a really quite interesting theory to apply to this text because it can invite all kinds of questions, such as, does this text still offer a moral story of value in the 21st century? Do we still largely judge men and women by the work and occupation they do? One might argue a man is still perhaps largely defined by his connection to the labour market, although that's one that, again, might be explored by Marxist theorists in a bit more depth. Or whether, in fact, this story is really one that is appropriately pitched at a child, perhaps as yet unable to write a text of their own, listening to this story in bed, being told to them by mum or dad before they go to sleep. So all kinds of questions raised by this particular text. So once the students have gone through a few lessons where they've built up their familiarity with the story, they've tried out some of the different critical lenses in a kind of no-risk, low-stakes environment where essentially they're posing questions to their classmates that are then going to be addressed and resolved in a seminar-style lesson. You've started to build up the foundation upon which they can then build their subsequent essay questions for their independent research topics that they choose, and hopefully pick texts that invite similar kinds of questions. It's a really powerful way of showing students that even though they might have read the same text 4 times, looking at the same words on the same page, organized in the same paragraphs, the interpretation of those words is largely conditioned by the colour of the lens that they bring to the reading experience. So it goes back to that whole kind of reader response theory idea that meaning is as much generated, or perhaps not as much, but a significant degree of meaning making is delegated to the reader, even after the writer has put down their pen and started reading it once through themselves. So that's my offer to you as a way forward into the text. So what I'd like to look at next then is how you shape your students' text selections and how you guide them on setting appropriate questions. And then we might look at how you manage the process that proceeds from the writing of the first draft through to the submission of the final essays for marking, moderation, and submission to the exam board.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
Welcome back, everyone, to my show this evening on A-Level English Literature NEA tasks and how best to design and plan for them so that you and your students achieve, hopefully, the success that they deserve. So in the first section of the show, I gave you a little bit of context as to how we do it in my department. In the second section of the show, we looked at a Brothers Grimm story called The Four Skillful Brothers and started to explore some of the critical questions that were raised by that text and think about some of the tasks that we might get students discussing in class as they read it. And now I'd like to look at the critical phase, really, when it comes to thinking about submitting assessments to the exam board, which is the generation, the writing, the drafting, the creation of the work that the student is going to be involved in for however long you decide to set that for them to work on, and then how you ensure that the work they're submitting is work that you're happy with them submitting to the board. So the first thing to say, of course, is there is no particular stricture on how the NEA work is to be done in terms of timescales, beyond the fact that you have to usually submit it to your external moderator and the board by the 15th of May in most years, around about the 15th of May when it falls on a weekday. So the way we do it is our students start it in the Easter term of year 12. They do the reading for it, they do the planning for it in a booklet that we give them to get them to think about generic questions as to how they might write about texts. Our students then write the first draft over the summer holiday, and they return in the autumn term in year 13 with a first draft that we are in a position to look at. And thereafter, they receive feedback on that draft. They then go away and do some more work on it. We collect in something called an authentication draft, which is an intermediate draft that we don't mark, but we do keep just to check that students are making some kind of clear, demonstrable progress from the first draft to the final draft. And then we ask our students to submit their final draft of their coursework in the last week of January in year 13. So all of our NEA coursework is done and dusted by the end of January. Quite an important psychological marker point for many of our year 13 students, because after that date we can then focus on preparing them for the 80% of the marks that are available in their public exams at the end of year 13. And by the time you get to January, those year 13 exams are not so far away, even if you're only about halfway through your year 13 set texts. So how do we then get from that idea stage to that submitted final draft stage in a way that is both pain-free, or as pain-free as you can make it, for your students and for your departmental colleagues? Well, the first thing you've got to make sure you do is that I would suggest you guide your students' text selection. You may find that you've got a student who's perfectly comfortable writing on any text that they decide to write on, which is fine. In my view, I think you should try and let them fly if they think they've got the wingspan to attempt it. So we give our students a full free choice, more or less, on which text they pick, unless there's some kind of rubric infringement or we're not convinced that they satisfy the standard that the exam board are expecting from a student at A level. And AQA's general advice is that a text shorter than the yellow wallpaper, the famous feminist, I'm tempted to call it a long short story rather than novella, and anything longer than that is generally going to be fine with AQA for the praise text. But I would generally tend to avoid doing something too short, because the students need enough weight in terms of the key events in the text and some of the key characters in the text to make the essay worth developing and easier for them to think through. So guiding the text selection is quite important. A good way to start would be a reading list with some of the theories and texts that we know might work for each theory. Generally speaking, the best texts to pick for each theories are the ones where the theoretical approach is not obvious. So, for instance, choosing something like 1984, which I don't think could be chosen anyway, and a Marxist approach to 1984 doesn't really take students very far at all, because the text is largely about political power and how that power is wielded. And you need to be a bit more focused on aspects of class structure for that question to really do the student justice. So perhaps something like feminist theory or feminist approaches to reading a text like 1984 might be preferable to Marxist theory. So generally, you want to pick a text where the critical theoretical approach is not obvious, not given by the text before the student even starts doing the thinking. So a good approach is to have a list of texts that you think might work for each theory, and then suggest some possible themes that might guide the students shaping their own question. So a good reading list and a good text selection is quite important. My advice is to get students to write on their own individual texts rather than having multiple students doing texts in the same class. If your group is small enough, then there's no clearer signal you can send to AQA that your students are really engaged in further and independent reading by submitting a sample to your moderators, which shows that each student has picked their own text and their own question. So try, if you can, to tailor your texts and your questions to the students and their own interests. You're likely to get a piece of work out of them that way. So once you've decided about how the text might work, it's going to be really important to set a task that is open-ended enough for the student to explore their own ideas, but at the same time focused enough that they're not going to wander too far away from the theory that they have chosen. And setting text is a really important part of setting tasks is a really important part of the process, because, of course, if you remember, a student is writing an essay on a novel, usually, and a collection of poems. And the rules of the syllabus suggest that the theories have to be different across each essay. One particularly difficult area sometimes is where a student wants to do feminist theory and Marxist theory across the two essays, because there are quite a lot of texts where issues that are of interest to feminist critics are also issues that are likely to interest Marxist critics. So sometimes there's a bit of a careful stage that needs to go into the thinking of the essay title to ensure that students are pitching their tent on the right theory for the duration of their essay. And the approach we tend to like to use is to give students usually quite a controversial quotation, either taken from a contemporary review or taken from one of our colleagues pretending to be a reviewer on perhaps Newsnight Review, as it used to be in the 1990s, with some kind of fairly bold statement that a student can dismantle fairly thoroughly in the course of their essay, because agreeing with a question wholeheartedly is very rarely an ingredient for a fascinating literary essay. So we tend to give them some controversial slanted questions so they've got something to take on and argue with. It's also quite nice if that quotation comes from a particular essay or contemporary review, because then that just gives the students a bit more powder to work with as they aim for developing their own response as they take on the critical view. So setting a task is quite important. My experience suggests that you don't actually want the name of the theory in the question until you add on a tag phrase at the end, like with reference to Marxist ideas from the critical anthology, say how far you agree with this interpretation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So rather than setting students a question like, to what extent does Mary Shelley's Frankenstein present a Marxist reading of class? You might be better focusing on a specific fragment of Marxist theory, such as the power of money to transform social relations, and asking students to focus on that particular strand of Marxist theory rather than all of Marxist theory ever written, because the students are likely to struggle to maintain their focus for that entire essay. So thinking about how you wrap up the theory in a way that is going to be accessible and digestible to the students as they approach their text. So when it comes to setting the text, that's the best way to do it, I think, in my experience, and then ask the students to have a go at writing the question themselves. Generally speaking, I think if you give them a very broad question for a first draft, that's better than going too precise too early, because if they're going to be reading independently over the summer and drafting the essay themselves, they may subsequently discover over the summer actually they found a more interesting angle, even within their own theoretical approach, that they'd like to explore. So I like to give my students sometimes one or two working titles that they can use to then shape and form in their own way as their interest takes them down particular pathways in their independent reading. So in some ways, for those of you familiar with the AQA EPQ, structuring it rather like an EPQ, but without all of the hassle of the logbook work to do as they go along. One thing we also like to do, which again brings, I suppose, this task close to the EPQ, is asking students, once they've read their texts before they go away over the holiday, to give a little presentation to their group on what they've found out so far, or particular ways in which their text might satisfy the criticisms that might be levelled at it by an eco-critic or by a narrative theorist. So one good way of getting them thinking through the first draft before they even start committing it to their laptops when they get home over the summer is to ask them to produce, generally speaking, a 5-slide PowerPoint presentation to deliver to the class, in which they explore aspects of the author's background. They dig out some contemporary reviews of the text, so they have a sense of what contemporary readers thought of the novel before they start thinking about their own opinions and those of modern critics. And so they can get used to actually taking questions from other members of their class on what they've been doing with themselves in what can be, if you're not careful, something of a wind down time of year as they move towards the summer holiday, usually having completed mock exams and not yet having quite thought about how they're going to organise their UCAS applications for the following term. So that's a particularly good way of helping them be clear about their text, be certain that they're not going to suddenly want to change their text halfway through the summer, or even worse than when they return in the autumn term, and to give them some elementary experience of perhaps going and finding some websites about the author, particularly if it's a well-established canonical author. So if they're writing about someone like Emily Bronte, they might well go away and look at the Bronte Society's website. If they're writing about Emily Dickinson for their poetry, they might go away and look at the Emily Dickinson Museum and all of the resources that they have put online. So that you're trying to really inspire them to get enthusiastic about this author as a craftsperson, as somebody who was thinking about what they were writing as they were writing it. Once the students have left your site, you're then into possibly the most difficult part of the NEA process, which is how do you encourage your students to produce the best work of which they are capable without telling them what to write, because the specification simply doesn't allow you to do that. And if you did do that, you probably wouldn't be fulfilling the brief of what an A-level literature course is supposed to be doing just before students head off to university and perhaps decide to continue your subject at undergraduate level. So this is where, again, the EPQ, I think, sets a good model for how colleagues might choose to manage the authentication and drafting process that the students are going to go through. So when the students return in October, each student is assigned a supervising teacher from within the department, and each supervising teacher has probably at most 2 or 3 students under their wing. And they are responsible for ensuring that the students' work is being continually developed, so that they're working on the drafting process from October till January, not just simply sitting down over the Christmas holiday and doing it just before New Year's Day. And that teacher is also there to guide the students in terms of the mechanical processes of essay writing and some of the formal elements associated with referencing and various aspects of essay technique, I suppose, while also taking an interest in the topic that the students have chosen to write about. So the students will hand in their work in October, their first draft. The first draft will be read by the student's supervising teacher. The supervising teacher will then issue their student with a feedback meeting, which we record on Teams, because all of the feedback for our syllabus has to be oral and can't be written on the essay. And actually, it's supposed to take the form of questions rather than direct instructions on what to write or how to improve or develop the essay. So the student receives a 15-minute to 20-minute online meeting, which is recorded on Teams. And the reason we record it on Teams is so that we've got a record of what we've said to the students, and so that the students have got a record of what we've said to them that they can watch as many times as they like without having to return to us to ask us the same questions again. So each of our students is entitled to one feedback meeting on the content of their essay. In both the prose and the poetry task, and our staff will ask them questions about what they understand their theory to be, what they understand the key events in the text to mean, what critical reading they've applied, if any, how they've used the critical anthology, if they've used it at all, and what kinds of tools they've used to help them find further critical material that might be useful to the essay. And that's the key thing that AQA typically reassert in all of their examiners' reports each year. There is no strict requirement that students include the critical writing of other critics in their NEA essays. We've been told that now a number of times. However, if you're working with students at the A-star upper end of the mark scheme, and those students are looking to go on to English literature degrees or similar classics degrees, comparative literature degrees, anything in that kind of drama degrees, anything in that kind of realm, I think it would be a missed opportunity if you didn't give them that chance to experience what engaging with real live critical approaches can be. So we do give our students access to JSTOR, a really good resource for picking up critical essays. We do show them how to use Google Scholar as a means of finding critical texts as opposed to the general Google search engine. And we do give students particular guidance on set texts they might choose to include as secondary texts in their writing, as well as the critical anthology itself, of course, which also includes a number of extracts from significant critical theorists appropriate for understanding of students in Year 12 and Year 13. So once the feedback has been issued, the student then goes away and works on that essay. So in our case, the students generally get their feedback by October half term. They'll spend some of October half term working on their essay. Some of October half term in our school too, they'll also be focusing on revision for their first set of mock exams. Then in my place, take place at the end of October and the beginning of November. And then what we collect in December, just before they go on their Christmas holiday, is something we call an authentication draft. And if you don't ask your students yet to submit an authentication draft, I would strongly recommend that you do, because it makes a number of situations easier if you've got some hard written evidence, A, that the student is continuing to work on their draft as they go through the essay, and B, hasn't suddenly cut and pasted a load of content from somewhere else, dumped it into a Word document and handed it in January, or handed it in on your final submission date. So we keep an authentication draft to satisfy ourselves that the student's work is the student's work as we know them, and we can then measure the standard of that work against some of the other written work they do in the process of the normal teaching of the course. One other advantage of getting an authentication draft from them in December is that they get a sense that deadlines matter, and that if you stage the drafting for them in such a way that something is done before Christmas, then the likelihood is the thing they hand in after Christmas is going to be of a higher standard. Also provides an extra safety net, because sadly this does happen from time to time. If a student loses all of their work, their computer dies, their hard drive breaks, all of their stuff is lost, you've got something you can hand back to them, even if it's just the skeleton of an improving first draft rather than something that looks like the final thing. Or if they're ill for any reason and can't find something to submit later on, again, you've got that good piece of work. That's at least something you can give back to them. So that's how we do the process of drafting, and moderation comes after that. Once the student hands in to us their final draft at the end of January, the way we do moderation is we second mark each essay. So each essay in our department is marked by 2 markers. The first marker is the supervising teacher. The second marker is either me as head of department or one of my colleagues. And we look at the agreement of the marks, and where the marks are in agreement, then we just move on and submit those marks. Where there's a significant disagreement, then the essay will be marked by a third marker. We then are in a position to hand back the students' marks to them in enough time for them to lodge an appeal, to which they're entitled under JCQ regulations. And that gives us enough time to sort out a fourth marker, if one is necessary, external to the college, to mark the review of the essay. And that's something that's only happened in my department once in my time, 14 years in my department. So then you've got all of the work you need on your deadline day, hopefully, which in our case is at the end of January. I know other schools give their students much later to finish off their work. My experience would suggest that there's limited value in doing that, because a student who has missed a hard deadline is unlikely to make much improvement on an extension of 2 to 3 weeks, particularly if that extension of 2 to 3 weeks is eating into their revision time for the exam course that represents 80% of their final grade. So we implement a hard deadline, and our students submit their work by the end of January. So we've then got that psychological focus by the time we get to February on preparing everything for that year 13 2-paper set of exams. And that's how we do NEA, where we are in my particular setting. So what do we see as the benefits of this approach? Well, the one thing my colleagues and I like about this particular syllabus is it gives the students the opportunity to maximize their following of their interest. I've never yet read an essay following this particular model that a student hasn't shown some kind of interest in. They haven't always been stellar A-star grade pieces of work, but they've always at least engaged with the question that they've chosen or partly shaped themselves, with a text that they've shown some interest in. So giving the students the maximum choice, I think, is a really positive thing to do if your department's in a position to do it. If you're going to train students to be independent, then my view is take the most beneficial view of independence that you think will work for that student. And for the students I teach, that's usually giving them as much scope as they can to direct the focus of their own project, so that when they hand in that piece of work that you've required to be professionally formatted, referenced, and submitted with a bibliography, it really looks like a professional piece of critical work that you can praise them for on the submission day. The other reason I particularly like this approach is it generates a diversity of responses. I'm still every year presented with essays on texts that I don't know at the point in the year before the student tells me, oh, I'm going to write on this particular text. And the discoveries of authors I've made as a result of students saying, I'd like to write on this text, sir, what do you think, is one of the reasons that really keeps me coming back to teaching English literature at A-level in the way that we do. So I hope that's been an interesting overview for you of the way I would like to think A-level English literature NEA tasks can be delivered to support your department in performing well and to support your students in performing well. And if that's something that you're thinking about doing in preparation for teaching this particular course next year, whenever you start your NEA preparations, I'd urge you to perhaps consider giving the Brothers Grimm a look in as you start thinking about how to teach students in their approach to critical theory. So that's the way we do English literature NEA. I hope you found some of those ideas helpful and that you have found this evening's show a means of encouraging you to give your students as much freedom as you possibly can.
In education, we all want recruitment to be fair and inclusive because the gender pay gap won't disappear without clear, practical steps in how we hire. Recent national research shows schools are already taking meaningful action. 40% of leaders now include pay or progression details in adverts. 35% highlight well-being support, and around 1 in 5 are using anonymised shortlisting to reduce bias. Teaching vacancies, the Department for Education's free official job listing service, makes these steps easier with clear salary fields, flexible working filters, and an application format that supports blind recruitment. It also removes previous salary questions so candidates are assessed on their skills and experience rather than their past pay. For your next hire or your next role, go online and search Teaching Vacancies Gov UK.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
And that just about brings us to the end of another Sunday Late Show on Teachers Talk Radio, the home of education conversation. I hope you found this evening's show interesting and informative, particularly those of you who are teaching the syllabus that we've explored tonight and the text that we've walked through. And if you haven't already done so, I hope you will also find the time to subscribe to our Teachers Talk Radio social media accounts, leave a review of our shows on your preferred podcast provider, or consider getting in touch with a request to appear as one of our guests. If you are a classroom-based teacher or have some other close connection to the teaching profession, then we would love to hear from you. So check us out at our website, www.ttradio.org, and give us the opportunity to put your voice on the air. Thanks to all of you who've tuned in tonight, and do check out our other Teachers Talk Radio shows this week. We have a number of new hosts continuing to make their debuts, so look up the schedule on the website and give them a listen if you can. This week and every week on Teachers Talk Radio, there is simply so much excellent content to engage with from real teachers working with real students in real schools. You can find anything you've missed of the 2,500 or so shows so far at www.ttradio.org. And if you have something you want to say or ask others about education anywhere on planet Earth, then perhaps you should consider applying to join the station as a show host. We are always on the lookout for those with current or recent experience of the classroom and other less familiar educational settings. That's all from me for this evening. So thank you for listening, and we will speak again in August. Goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.